The year is 1986, and although movie theater audiences made it apparent that they were no longer excited by the idea of a Hollywood musical, an off-Broadway musical production with a cult following, based off a 1960s B-movie with a cult following, came to the big screen and bombed fantastically, only to later develop its own cult following. Our film tonight is Little Shop of Horrors, and this is the Cultworthy Cinema Podcast.
I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
And welcoming back to the show, my good friend Frank of the Silver Screeners podcast. I am so excited to have you on tonight, all the way across the country. And like you said right before recording, it's been a chunk of time since we talked. It was like last September. So, wow, it's been a minute, but time flies, right?
Time doesn't just fly. It's been a rocket ship. It's been crazy. But yeah, no, we did a couple of episodes, 2 back-to-back episodes in September when you were on my show. And I was on your show around that time. And like you said, seems to be a 6-month rotation. So I'm all for it.
But, you know, it always feels like I'm still connected to you because we talk on Twitter and we kind of bounce back and forth in the social. So like I feel like I'm still talking to you. It's just not directly on the podcast. So yeah, great. And I can't wait to get back onto your show. It's just been a lot going on. I'm doing video now. So I'm doing musicals this month of March, and I reached out to you to see if you wanted to talk about this one, because this is, I'm going to say, after Rocky Horror Picture Show, probably the second most popular cult musical, at least of the last 30, 40 years. I mean, if you think of cult musicals of the 80s, I really think that this is the one that everyone thinks about. I mean, what is your opinion on that?
I think when it comes to 80s musicals, at least 80s musicals that are remembered fondly, this is definitely in the upper echelon. There have been a couple of musicals that were made before Little Shop. Xanadu comes to mind.
Done it.
Grease.
Done it.
But when it comes to something that people don't have how do I word this? People will completely trash Xanadu and laugh as they watch it.
Yeah.
They'll trash or at least mock Grease as they watch it. People watch Little Shop to have a good time.
To have a good time, but also Little Shop is kind of challenging, right? It's PG-13. It's kind of violent. It's definitely dark. I think it was tickling the funny bone of people who are into, let's say, more sinister type of entertainment before it became more mainstream. Like Tim Burton, I think, is the one that really kind of got people zoned in on the idea of like, we can have something a little bit dark, a little bit quirky, a little bit devious and mysterious. And we saw a lot of people try to copy that aesthetic for the last 30, 40 years. But Little Shop, what I think has to its advantage is that the person behind it is, in terms of filmmaking, the director, he already kind of had a history of doing some things that were kind of quirky and dark and off color for most people. And I'm talking about Frank Oz, one of the original pioneers of the Muppets. And here he is directing his first live action film that's not a Muppet film. And he does a fantastic job with it. But at the same time, you still kind of feel that vibe and that tone of a darker Muppet movie. You know what I'm talking about?
I do. I mean, this was the guy who was the voice of Miss Piggy for
right.
How many years?
Right, and Yoda.
and Yoda. So he had connections to Lucasfilm, and he had connections to Jim Henson. And here he is taking this piece of Broadway property. Like you said, it was an off-Broadway show. At that point in time, it had never reached Broadway.
Right.
And who makes up the cast? But with the exception of Ellen Greene, you have SCTV alum. You have SNL alum. So these are not trained singers, and they're all playing the main roles. So to have that, I think it was a good selling point from a marketing perspective. You know, these are comedians you all know, you all love. They've been popular on TV for years. But as far as selling it as a quote unquote bona fide musical, a musical version of an off-Broadway show, I think that's when it might have gotten into trickier territory. But Ellen Greene, she reprises her role from the stage production. So, and even she was very campy in the role, which was appropriate for the tone of the film.
Well, also, man, like, how often do you see a performer be able to create a character on the stage and be able to transpose that character and all their mannerisms and all their, little identities into the screen version? It's very rare. And it's also, in my opinion, kind of rare to have someone set a tone for a character, and then when it is, let's say, revived on Broadway, off Broadway, in junior high school productions, wherever this thing plays, for the most part, people still use that same character design, that same character dynamic that she created for the original stage version. They still do it. They still use the voice. They still use the costuming for the most part. I mean, I'm sure there are some, editorial choices that some people do, but for the most part, she created that character, and it's pretty much stayed consistent in all the decades that this show is run in whichever production venue it's run in. You can't really say that about a lot of stuff. Like Guys and Dolls, people are going to play Sky Masterson however they want. People are going to play any character from pretty much any show the way they interpret it. But there's very few characters from stage shows that actually can be transposed onto film or into other productions and still have that same aesthetic. And Ellen Greene will just always be known for creating that character, in my opinion.
I think she's severely underused. To the best of my knowledge, and I could be wrong, but I don't think that she really did too much on Broadway afterwards, did she? I know that she had a small role in One Fine Day, that romantic comedy with George Clooney and Michelle Pfeiffer back in the 90s. So I know she was in that, and I know she's done, little bit roles and appearances in films here and there, but she never became a bona fide star, not in film, and as far as I know, not on stage.
Yeah, like with film, really, she's just been in a lot of cult productions. For example, she plays the mom in The Professional, of Natalie Portman's mom who gets shot in the bathtub. So she plays that role.
Right.
She plays the teacher in Pump Up the Volume. So like she did have little roles throughout the 80s and the 90s. But I agree with you, like she really never took off as a superstar, but she's still like a cult icon. Like people cosplay her all the time. And like I said, she created an aesthetic.
Okay, first of all, I had no idea that she was the teacher in Pump Up the Volume.
Yeah. Yeah,
I'm going to have to go back. It's been a good 30, 31, 32 years since I've seen that one, but now I'm going to go back for that alone.
Yeah, no, it's fun to see her pop up and stuff. I think the last thing I remember seeing her in was she is the bartender in the film The Cooler with William H. Macy. And
is this the one that got Alec Baldwin his Oscar nomination? Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
she's the bartender who is always getting stiffed by the cocktail waitresses, and she kind of has like this attitude, and it's like, oh, it's Ellen Greene. It's fantastic. I want to talk about really fast just the origin of how Frank Oz got into this role of director. So the film was originally conceived by David Geffen. So David Geffen, who created Geffen Records, he was one of the original financiers and producers of the off-Broadway show. He's also responsible for the careers of Howard Ashman and Alan Menken, who did the music and wrote the script for the show. He's responsible for getting them into the Disney pantheon, and they had those three back-to-back killers. They had Little Mermaid, they had Beauty and the Beast, and they had Aladdin. And when you listen to the songs in all those movies, you can almost put them right next to the songs in Little Shop of Horrors. Like they have the same beat, they have the same patterns, they have the same patois, so to speak. I mean, Ellen Greene's song, Somewhere That's Green, may as well be part of your world from The Little Mermaid. Like if you play them on top of each other, they're almost the exact same. So then that's great. And that's why like Lerner and Lowe and, all these different composers and lyricists, the Sherman Brothers, it's why they are recognizable in all of their things, because they have a pattern. It's like a Taylor Swift song sounds like a Taylor Swift song. Alan Menken and Howard Ashman song sounds like that. So they're very digestible and addictive. And that's one of the reasons why I really like this musical, because I'm not a musical fan, because I don't like the music in most musicals. But because this is really poppy and catchy and it plays to that, I don't know, cotton candy brain I have, it makes me feel better about enjoying a musical, because of the content, the darkness of it, and the songs are really good. But I got to get back to the filmmaker. So Frank Oz, how this all happened. David Geffen partners up with Steven Spielberg. Spielberg is like, hey, I like this idea. Let's turn it into a movie. And Martin Scorsese is the first director that's interested in it. Now, because Roger Corman, who directed the original version in the 60s, he didn't pass a copyright on this thing. So it just became public domain. That's why like it's on multiple versions of DVD and VHS, and it's always on Tubi or YouTube. It's in a million different places. Anyone can sell it. But the original writer was fighting them legally, even though it was public domain, to at least get some piece of the action, right? So because that held up the process of getting it produced, Scorsese and Spielberg walked away, but Geffen still wanted to do it. The next person in line was John Landis, Blues Brothers, American Werewolf in London. And something that John Landis liked to do is he liked to put directors of other films in cameos in his movies. So, for example, Frank Oz pops up in Trading Places as the guy in the police station who tries to plant the drugs on Lewis. And because of that connection, he's like, well, I got a guy. He just directed a Muppet movie. Frank Oz just directed Muppets Take Manhattan. He would know how to work all this puppetry nonsense better than I could. And that's how he got the job. And his career essentially was built off of that. And, you know, he'd go on to do Dirty Rotten Scoundrels and Bowfinger and so on and so forth. But yeah, it all started because of Muppets and his connections to John Landis.
I don't know about you, but in my opinion, there is nothing that the Muppets cannot do.
Agreed.
They if they can get that career going, if that results in a big break for a first time or a relatively newcomer to directing, then God bless those those creations of Jim Henson.
100%. And it really serves to the aesthetic of the movie too, because even though it takes place in like 1960s New York, it was shot on a huge soundstage in Pinewood Studios. It was the same stage that Labyrinth was shot in. So as they tore down Labyrinth, They built up this set, and almost the entire crew from Labyrinth was the crew for Little Shop of Horrors. So when you look at the lighting design and the shot compositions and just the way he frames things, it's weird to say that this could have been a film of Muppets, right? Like the human characters in this movie, they could have been Muppets and this movie still would have worked. Like that's just the way the film plays. That's Frank Oz's eye, and it's the talent and the creativity behind the people that made this movie. And I think it was a good stepping stone for him to say, okay, I'm going to step away from felt and ping pong balls with eyeballs painted on them into this world where I'm actually using human characters. But like you said earlier, he relied heavily on sketch comedy people, right? John Candy, Bill Murray, Steve Martin. We've got Christopher Guest that pops up for a second, right? So these are essentially living Muppets, in my opinion. So it's really easy to get those performances that you want from these guys. And it just adds to that humor, but also adds to the aesthetic that you're watching something not natural. And that's what I like about it.
You know, it's funny because my first time ever hearing of Little Shop of Horrors, I was probably 12 or 13 years old. The movie had finished its brief run in the theaters, and it was now playing on HBO, and it was available on home video. So that's how I first saw it. And my initial reaction as a preteen was, really, it was, what the hell am I watching?
Right.
Jeez and crow, what the fuck is this? But I enjoyed a lot of the sight gags, and I already, of course, because I was watching SNL at that point, old SNL reruns on Nickelodeon, you know, I knew who Bill Murray was, and Steve Martin, and Rick Moranis, of course, from Ghostbusters, and John Candy from Splash. So these were not new faces to me. So that was what pulled me in. But I specifically remember thinking to myself, and I feel the total opposite now, but the three singers, the three female singers who basically portray the role of the Greek chorus in the film, and on the stage production as well. I remember thinking, and I didn't know what a Greek chorus was at the time, and I just remember thinking to myself, not that they were annoying, but just the fact that they were standing around witnessing everything and singing about everything that was going on screen. I can remember thinking to myself, man, won't they ever go away? And just
Right?
and let the comedians do their thing. Of course, I have a much better appreciation for them
Yeah.
now, and I think that they are one of the highlights of the film. But the next time that I was privy to Little Shop of Horrors, do you remember a TV show called Head of the Class?
Oh yeah, for sure.
They had an annual episode that always was filled with, thrill to the high drama of the latest goings on, and there was always the episode where they did the annual spring musical.
Mhm.
And they did an episode where they did Little Shop of Horrors. Do you remember that one?
Vaguely, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
So that was my next time. It's like, oh yeah, that was that movie. But then it all came to a head when I was in college. I was involved in theater in college, and it was my sophomore year, and I was cast as Mr. Mushnick.
Perfect. I'm sorry.
I
Typecasting.
mean, the resemblance is uncanny. But I was cast as Mr. Mushnick, and then we had people that I went to school with. They played all the other roles, and for me, one of the highlights of the show was when I got to climb inside the plant.
Right. As you're getting
And
eaten.
the guy who was inside manually operating it, I just remember it was like those push bars at the gym.
Mm-hmm.
He was like to open and shut the mouth. And when I was getting eaten, I remember I was supposed to throw my arm over the bottom jaw, and then he was supposed to clamp down on it, and I was supposed to scream louder and then pull the arm back in to make it look like he was slurping my arm back in. So that was a blast. That was a blast. I had a lot of fun with the goofiness of it all. I specifically remember my family hating it.
Oh no.
They came to see it, especially my poor little grandmother. She was the very little Italian woman, God bless her, and she said, "Ooh, that was awful. You enjoyed that?" It's like she had never heard of this show before in her life. She's just watching her grandson, being devoured by this carnivorous piece of vegetation. So that was a fun experience.
It's funny that you say that because, when I talked about at the very beginning of my intro that this was a financial bomb in the theater, we have to remember that for over 50 years before this, there was a reverence to the musical, right? There was a reverence to the Broadway musical where, yeah, you could have humor in your musical, but most of the time they were love stories or they were some kind of like human drama that was enhanced by song. And you didn't see a lot of satire. You didn't see a lot of goofiness and silliness and camp in these productions. And that's one of the reasons why this was off Broadway and not on Broadway, right? And when I think about the musicals of the early 80s, Grease, it was an off-Broadway show too, There was like an irreverence to it. I want to say probably up until that point, one of the most irreverent musicals there probably was in the mainstream was West Side Story, just because of its subject matter and then the gang slang that they would use. But for the most part, they were love stories. It was, Cinderella and Oklahoma and Carousel and My Fair Lady, like there was a reverence and a prestige to these things. And so I think when people were starting to kind of get tired of that, they didn't know what to attach themselves to. And that's why the more offbeat musicals like Rocky Horror, the Popeye musical, Xanadu the Apple, while they had their cult followings, they were very hard to attach a mainstream audience to them because I think they just weren't cool enough for the younger generation, but they were too outlandish for the older generation that grew up with these prestige musicals. But now we can look at them fondly, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you think about the fact that The Sound of Music and Hair debuted within a decade of each other.
Right.
I mean, you can't get much more polar opposite than that, just in terms of, I use the word, in air quotes, but in terms of sophistication and dignity and storytelling with a purpose, as opposed to the actors really smoking pot on stage and stripping down and, just reflecting the changing of the times. I mean, this was a show that captured the zeitgeist of everything with the counterculture movement. And I think that Jesus Christ Superstar also had a big role in that because that caused controversy to a point. I think more from the older generations who were just taken aback by this rock opera that was depicting, this sacred text that for centuries nobody ever dared to make a wisecrack about or to do anything tongue-in-cheek about. So yeah, I absolutely agree that everything up until that point, because Grease was released I should say, Grease on stage premiered in 1972, Jesus Christ Superstar in 1971. It was an interesting time, and I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall to see what was going on inside people's minds, what was being scribbled inside the critics' notebooks, as they were probably, you think about it, they were probably, if you have a critic who in the late 60s, early 70s might have been, say, in their 50s.
Yeah.
That means that they probably, if they were a critic their entire career, going back 30 years, they were probably sitting in theaters in the early 40s watching shows like Arsenic and Old Lace, or the ones that you mentioned, Oklahoma, The King and I, just all of these musicals that are regarded as the classics, Gigi.
It takes a while for audiences and critics to catch up. On my other show, the Back to the Balcony show, which is about Siskel and Ebert, one of the things we notice is like in their late 70s and early 80s episodes, they still have a lot of reverence to the craft and a lot of reverence to the filmmakers and styles of the 60s and 70s. I mean, they love New Hollywood, but they had a hard time grasping the quirkiness and avant-gardeness of the early 80s, right? Like, they just didn't dig it in their criticism. But when the 90s came along, there was a good decade of tempering, right? They were being tempered in modern film and being tempered in modern audience expectations, that they started changing their opinions of films that, if you watch the earlier episodes, they were very harsh towards. And then eventually they became really open to. I think one of the most interesting aspects of that is, they hated Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs, but then just a few years later, they loved Pulp Fiction, and it's not that it like really had a different aesthetic or a different frame. They're very similar in the way they tell their story. They're nonlinear. A lot of the camera angles are the same. There's a lot more humor and quirkiness to Pulp Fiction, but I feel it always took them a little bit of time to adjust to whatever the modern audiences were digging. And that's one of the things that I keep going back to, the 80s, where it's like the musical was essentially dead. Pop music, Michael Jackson, MTV, that's what was getting the attention for musical audiences. So when this bombed fantastically, as most musicals in the 80s did, Xanadu bombed. Popeye kind of made its money back, but it's considered a critical bomb. And then you had a lot of those underground ones like The Return of Captain Invincible and Shock Treatment, which is the sequel to Rocky Horror. Like, none of these did well, but they all had cult followings. So let's talk about these stars now, because Rick Moranis has always been known as like that good side man, right? A good side character. Louis Tully from Ghostbusters, the Mackenzies, and Strange Brew pops up in, a multitude of Canadian pictures. Eventually he would have like more leading roles in the 90s with the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Little Giants and stuff like that. But it was hard to sell that movie with him as the star because the main character is a nerd. And, apart from Revenge of the Nerds, that wasn't a popular dynamic to be in 80s movies. Then you've got the Skid Row people. You've got Ellen Greene, who's like the quirky. I think nowadays she'd be considered like a manic pixie and people would just fall in love with her right away. But in the 80s, she wasn't the glamour girl. She wasn't the Madonna. She wasn't the Cyndi Lauper. She wasn't one of those people.
No, she was a lot more emo, I think.
A little bit,
before
yeah.
Emo was a thing.
Yeah, if the 60s emo thing was a thing. So I think that was the first reason why it didn't hit the mainstream so well, is that it didn't have bankable stars, right? The bankable stars were all side characters, Steve Martin and Bill Murray, but those are practically cameos. But they really kind of do make the movie, right?
Oh, they certainly creates what for me is the most memorable scene, Bill Murray's cameo.
For sure.
Which was not written expressly for them, because that was Jack Nicholson's cameo in the black and white film version in the 60s. So it's not as if the scene was a sketch that they came up with and pitched or anything like that. Bill Murray certainly, though, did put his own personal stamp on the way that he played that role, different from the way Jack Nicholson did.
Yeah, Nicholson plays it very quiet and sinister and mysterious, right? Like, he's just Jack Nicholson. He wants the pain. He likes the pain. Where in this version, I gotta say, man, I think that might be Bill Murray's funniest performance. Because a lot of people like Bill Murray, but when he's in his outlandish and bombastic performances, it's a lot to handle in a like hour and a half, 2 hour amount of runtime. You know what I mean? He always does best
It
in
can get to be a bit much.
it gets to be a bit much. He always does best in roles like Peter Venkman or let's say Groundhog Day, where he can be goofy, but he's got like a baseline. So when you have small doses of Bill Murray with this much mania, it's hysterical, but it only works because it's 5 minutes.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, the whole scene was obviously played up to be, he was getting, if I may be so brazen, he was getting a sexual kick out of this whole experience, sitting in this dentist chair, and all of the, no Novocaine. And Steve Martin, of course, is only too thrilled to have no Novocaine. Being the sadist
He's a sadist.
And you just see Bill Murray's fingers like squeezing his shoulders, like, oh yes, oh yeah. What was this film rated?
PG-13. It's the second best
Okay, so
on-screen
PG-13.
orgasm since When Harry Met Sally. I think like Meg Ryan's got number 1 spot, and then Bill Murray in Little Shop of Horrors gets number 2.
That's an interesting list, actually.
That should be an episode. Next time we get together, let's put like all the best on-screen orgasms of the 80s.
You are wrong.
Let's talk about Steve Martin now, because again, that is another character that it's a small role, but there are no small roles, right? Like he is the main plot driver if you think about it. He is the reason why Seymour turns to the dark side after he's had this plant influence him, right? Like he is the reason why Seymour will commit murder, because he's in love with Audrey and this guy's abusive. And that's like the weird part about this character, and it's why dark comedy for some people is just unwatchable, is you're laughing at a character who sadistically beats women and inflicts pain and torture onto his patients. And he has a whole song about how he is a sadist and that his mom told him he would be a sadist because he used to shoot puppies with a BB gun and smash kitty cat heads.
Smash kittens in the heads. And yeah.
But we're laughing at him. Like, it's a funny performance. It's a funny role. But that's like the dark side of comedy, where it's like, okay, I'm laughing my ass off at this guy, but should I be? Because he's actually like a dark figure.
Well, and I still remember some of Mr. Mushnick's lines to Audrey when he saw injuries on her. I specifically remember at the beginning of the show, she's sporting a black eye. And I can remember turning to the person playing Audrey. And I can remember having the line, Audrey, where did you get that shiner?
Yeah.
And she says, shiner?
Shiner?
And she, she's just, pretends he doesn't know what he's talking about, and sort of dismisses it. And then all he has to say about it after that is, Audrey, that greasy boyfriend of yours, he's been beating up on you again? And she just stays silent. And then he says, I know it's none of my business, but I'm beginning to think maybe he's not such a nice boy.
Yeah, that's exactly the
And that's all he has to offer. And it's like, thank you, Dr. Phil.
Well, I mean, like, he is such a hard-ass character from Skid Row. Like, if that's the best paternal advice he can give, at least it's something, right? Yeah. He drops little nuggets. He drops little nuggets throughout the movie.
Little pieces of concern for Audrey.
And speaking of that performance, Vincent Gardenia as Mr. Mushnick, I think, does a fantastic job. Us cult movie guys would know him as Detective Ochoa from the Death Wish movies. But
Death Wish movies.
Here he gets to
Frank
play
Lorenzo from All in the Family.
Yeah, he gets to play a little bit more fun, a little bit more paternal in a sense. But yeah, that's the thing. And like, there are lines throughout the film, especially by Ellen Greene, where she's, when they're asking her if she's going to feel bad that the dentist, Dr. Orin Scavelli, is missing. And she's like, actually, it's not a bad thing at all, because now I'll save money on Epsom salts and Ace bandages. It's like,
Ace bandages.
That's a dark ass line, but it's played for laughs, and we're laughing at it. But at the same time, it's like, we're laughing at abuse. That's so, to me, that's genius writing, when you can make a subject so dark and disturbing, but put a play on it where we can laugh at it because we know that humor and her nonchalant approach to it is her self-defense, right? Like, she's not going to
Right,
crumble down and
right.
cry. She is from Skid Row. She can't afford to let herself break down. So she makes jokes about her abuse. She makes jokes about being a used girl in a nightclub. That's the thing. Like, if you don't pay attention to the lyrics of the songs, if you don't pay attention to some of that fast-paced dialogue, you don't get the backstory that these characters are giving you of how dark their pasts really are. Like, she is a used girl, and Seymour was an orphan that got taken in by this guy and essentially used as indentured servitude of running his flower shop, in exchange for a cot in the basement and
And a
and
crust
a crust of
of
bread, right? But that's the whole point of the song Skid Row is,
that
living
whole
that.
song. If you really go through the lyrics to that song, to Downtown, it's just the alarm goes off at 7. You start uptown. You put in your 8 hours for the powers that have always been till it's 5 p.m. And then you go downtown where the folks are broke,
Right.
where your life's a joke, where you buy your token. You go down to Skid Row. And then even when you're uptown, life sucks up there too. Uptown, you cater to a million jerks. Uptown, you're messengers and mailroom clerks, eating all your lunches at the hot dog carts. Bosses take your money and they break your hats. I mean, this is
A great
this
lyricist
is,
Howard Ashman was, That's why his songs in the
and it's
Disney movies are
really
so
just
good. Like, they broke that mold of being, cheesy, fanciful songs to actually having some meaning to them. And again, maybe that's the other reason why, like, people couldn't identify with this movie, because if the movie comes out in 86, we are at the peak of, like, 80s capitalism where the middle class is stronger than it's ever been.
oh yeah, Reaganomics is all around. Yeah,
So watching the Skid Row song and being downtown and working for, the powers that have always been, it's almost like a kind of bitter nostalgia of, like, oh yeah, remember when we had to do that? Remember those times? And then, like, if you sang that song today, it's like, oh shit, that's what a lot of people are living in right now. Again, where it's, they can't afford their rent, they can't afford their food. So that's one of the things that I think that is not just about musicals, just movies and stories in general, is that the history is always destined to repeat itself, right? So whenever something was pertinent in the time it was released, it might not be recognizable in decades after that. Like, oh, remember back in the day when we used to have to scrimp and save, and now we're living, on the hog. But then 20 years later, it's back to that. So it is like a cyclical thing of things to have different meanings for different times. And, perhaps this has more relevance in this decade than it did in the decade that it came out.
you think of a film. You think of a stage production, which became a film,
Mm-hmm.
like Rent. Rent was the show to see in the mid 90s.
It was the 90s. Yeah, that's the 90s.
But it was the song's even called "Living in America" at the end of the millennium. And what are their concerns? Their concerns are the AIDS virus. Their concerns are being, living a bohemian lifestyle in Greenwich Village,
and gentrification, and yeah,
gentrification, and interestingly enough, considering where we are today, they are so anti-technology growth.
mm-hmm.
They don't want anything to do with Cyberland, where they drink Diet Coke. They want to drink milk, from the cow that Idina Menzel sings about. Only thing to do is jump over the moon.
Mm-hmm.
So, but then, does that translate well to today?
It doesn't.
It's like, no. I cannot picture one person saying, "Yeah, you're right. I will never use a cell phone." I mean, maybe people don't use them as much as others, but it's not the vehement, this is not the direction we're going in at the end of the millennium kind of feeling.
Right.
But then you take a look at a show like Little Shop of Horrors. Really, at its core, what is this story about? To me, anyway, this story is about a group of people who had no chance. They had no chance for anything in life.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Mushnick, he ran a flower shop, and that was all he was ever going to be.
Mm-hmm.
That was all he was ever going to do. He has no family, no wife, no kids. He brings Seymour in, and again, like you said, just cheap indentured servant. Audrey, I mean, we don't hear anything about Audrey's family. There's no background established there, so we can presume that she's probably been spending her years, her coming of age years, just becoming more and more street smarter. Maybe, or at least, if not street smart, then just getting
It's street survival. Like it really is
get street survival skills.
it really
Yeah.
is a movie about survival, and when opportunity arises, what are the lengths you're willing to go to make that opportunity work for you, right? It's painted in the
Yeah.
picture of a sci-fi horror story with this plant from outer space, but even the plant's song is like, it may as well be like a Faustian story, right? Where the plant essentially is the devil, and it is luring Seymour to give up his innocence in exchange for fame and for money to get out of Skid Row. Like, that's the dream. And it's a dream that someone's willing to commit murder for and feed bodies to a plant. And then at the end, when he reveals, like, he does the big Bond reveal, it's like, no, I set you up all along, man. Like, the whole plan was to get you famous and get people to want little Audrey IIs in little baskets so we can take over the world. Like, it's a Faustian story, 100%. We just don't really recognize it because we're seeing a singing plant,
Done by Frank Oz.
Right. So, yeah, I got to say one more thing about this movie, and that is the ending is very different from the
Yes.
Broadway production. And since you were in the Broadway production, how about you let us know how the original ending works?
So the difference between the film version and the stage version, they split off just as Audrey is looking at the plant and she's feeling sorry for it. Oh, your branches are so dry, you poor thing. Here we go, let me give you some water. And she falls into the plant and he begins chewing her. And in the film, Seymour comes in, he saves her, and then he and the plant have it out and big explosion, and he and Audrey go off to live in that tract house that they share somewhere that's
Right.
green. And they have their happy ending, which was not the original film ending either, but we'll get to that in a bit. The stage production, there she is, she's inside the plant's munching away. Seymour runs in, he does pull her out. He asks her if she's okay. She says no, and she collapses to the ground. And she says to him, Seymour, I want you to get everything in life that you deserve. So she makes the ultimate sacrifice. She says, feed me to the plant, and that way you can get all of the happiness in the world. He does not want to do this, but she insists, and then she dies in his arms. And he's now holding her dead body in his arms, and he proceeds to feed her to the plant. He proceeds to feed her to the plant. Now, you could make the argument that it was not a selfish move, that it was not because he was looking for everything that she said he would get out of it. You could make the argument that he was in love with her so much that he was honoring her dying wishes, her dying request. I suppose we could debate about that one for hours, but he does feed her to the plant. So now she's completely gone from the show. And he sits there all depressed all night long. And then dawn breaks. And then that's when they all come in and they begin to get the little planters, and they're filling it up with soil, and they're getting all the little Audrey IIs, the replicas, going. And Seymour gets really mad, and he says, that was what you had in mind all along, wasn't it? World domination. And so he takes a sword or some kind of a weapon, and he says, inside that pod, he says, I'm going to cut you up and blah, blah, blah. And of course, he loses. The plant eats Seymour too. So the entire cast is killed off. Mushnick has been eaten.
Audrey's been eaten.
The dentist has been eaten. Audrey, Seymour, they've all been eaten. And then we have the Greek chorus come out, and they sing a song that's not in the film, where they're basically singing to the audience, subsequent to the events you have just witnessed, the plant took over the world. Right. Basically, they say that the plants, successfully manipulated other saps and other jerks like Seymour is. Like they finding jerk, they use the word jerks in the lyrics. So the plant would just go on manipulating all of these vulnerable people who want more living out of life than what their life circumstances are allowing them, promising them all of these, they have all these delusions of grandeur. And so it's a really bleak portrayal of what happens when someone who has nothing is promised great things if they just do this.
If they just sign that book, right?
sign the devil's book in the woods and go to Tituba and say, okay, I want to see my future husband.
There you go.
The whole Salem witch trial thing. So that's the ending song is, they're singing, the plants are coming after you. Look out. Here comes Audrey II. Look out. And, so the song ends with the plant like growing bigger and bigger. And depending on the production and the size auditorium you have, you can go in any direction with that. But basically the show ends with the four of us, the dentist and Mushnick and Seymour and Audrey. We were all now inside Audrey, but there were face holes cut into the what was supposed to be literally like the plant's innards. So we stuck our faces through them. We were all pale, we were all dead, and we're all singing to the audience as well, saying, basically, don't make the same mistake that we did.
Right.
Now, one could be over analytical and say, oh, so what is the what is the real message, the universal message for the world that this show is putting out there? Or one could say, give me a break. They're inside a plant, and it's just supposed to be a good time. It's Frank Oz. Right. Stop reading so much into it. But it's a very different ending from the movie where she cries in happiness and tears, and they join hands and they dash off down the perfectly manicured lawn and into that tract house where they'll watch Lucy on a big, enormous 12-inch screen and the whole thing. She cooks like Betty Crocker. She looks like Donna Reed.
Yeah. So, I mean, here's the funny part is the ending you just described, they filmed that. They filmed the original ending. The original ending was 1/5 of the movie's budget. So the movie was made for $25 million, so it was a fifth of that. So $5 million was essentially just for that ending. And it was so impressively done. It's on YouTube and it's on the Director's Cut Blu-ray, where you can go back and you can watch it where, so Seymour feeds Audrey to the plants. He has like fight with him. Seymour gets eaten. And then the plants take over. It's almost like a King Kong kind of thing where you've got giant plants going through New York City, knocking taxi cabs off the road. It almost feels kind of like an Independence Day kind of catastrophe disaster where instead of aliens blowing up the city, these plants are literally tearing it apart, tearing down train tracks and stations. It was a big budget production. Audiences hated it. The test audiences were so pissed off that all your characters got eaten and that the plants took over the world that they went and they spent like another several $1 million and chopped the ending off and put a new one on. And that's one thing that I can say about this movie is that there's a very prominent cut in tone and appearance when it hits. And it's exactly when you said it. After Audrey is getting chewed on, Seymour pulls her out and they go out into the alley and they sing like a reprise of Suddenly Seymour. James Belushi shows up and it's like, hey kids, I want to buy these plant things. That's all new. They rewrote that.
Yeah.
And then they wrote a new song, the Mean Green Mother from Outer Space.
Mean Green Mother.
They wrote that just because people hated the original ending, and they created this new, happier version where Seymour and Audrey win. And there's still like a little wink and a nod where there is an Audrey II mini at the end, in the garden bushes and stuff like that.
The front lawn.
So it has that little ominous tone at the end, but there's lots of director cuts out there of different movies. There's lots of alternative endings that we see. I'd say that this is like in the top 10 of the biggest differentials between the original version and the modified version that studio audiences and test audiences wanted.
This was Seymour literally getting away with murder.
Yeah, for sure.
It's in the guise of a happy ending. Right. He has the blood of his employer, his girlfriend's ex. He has the blood of these people on his hands, and he gets his happy ending. So is it a happy ending? And what's funny because according to the two of them, again, it looks like they looked perfectly content to forget everything ever happened.
Yeah. And that speaks back to the time again where people wanted that fairy tale ending. Now for the last 20 years, we live in the world of M. Night Shyamalan's and A24 movies where like downer and downbeat endings are cool again. We like it when we see people get away with shit. Saltburn is like one of the biggest talked about endings in the last 10 years, I'd say, because, oh, you're going to let him get away with that? That's how it's going to end? It's like, yeah, essentially that's kind of how Little Shop ended, right? The guy got away with it.
He got away with it and didn't seem to think that it should bother him. Like, it looked like it would never cross his mind again. They were just all caught up in their euphoria of, I have my Audrey, and she says, I have my Seymour, and but Saltburn.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say that Little Shop of Horrors is the Saltburn of the 80s. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not saying that.
Oh, no,
I'm not saying the director's cut, Rick Moranis dances around the flower shop naked, but I'm just saying that people like a downbeat ending, or at least like to talk about it more than they used to in the 80s. In the 80s, we still wanted our Hollywood ending, right? Let's talk about just the cult legacy of this thing, where, so yeah, the musical came out, I think it was like 81 or 82 off Broadway, and it had a couple year run. It was like early 80s. This hits in 86, fails miserably at the box office, but is a hit on home video. And there's a few reasons for that. Number one, the original movie poster for theaters did not really explain what the movie was, right? But then the home video box is the cover that I think all of us remember. It's the plant and all the tentacles and tendrils of it each have a different cast member, and it's holding them over its mouth.
They're all dangling.
And people would see that on the video shelf. It's like, what is this movie? And they'd rent it, and it's a musical, and it's fun, and it's quirky, and it became a cult hit on video, and eventually a cult hit on cable. And to this day, it's still a cult favorite that millennials and Gen Zs are discovering all the time. You can go into Hot Topic and see Audrey II earrings and Audrey II stuff. Like, the merchandising and the pop culture coolness of it has only gotten bigger since it came out. And that kind of goes back to that question that gets asked on my show a lot is, can you intentionally make a cult film, or do they all happen by happenstance, right? And I say that you can intentionally make a cult film if it strikes when the iron's hot, right? Like, you can go out and say, I'm going to make a cult movie, and people might recognize the genius of it and embrace it, and then it becomes a cult movie, or it becomes nothing. This was obviously a film that they wanted to be like a big movie, a prestige movie, but eventually wound up as a cult film.
Movies like The Princess Bride, movies like Little Shop of Horrors, even movies like It's a Wonderful Life, Singing in the Rain, which are regarded now as among the best of the best. None of these movies made much of a dent at the box office when they were initially released.
Wizard of Oz, man.
And it's thanks to Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz. I mean, they barely recouped their budget.
Yeah, it was considered a failure at the time, and now it's like a legend of cinema. So, yeah. You deal with young people all the time. You're a teacher in this field. Do you hear students or people that you talk to ever speak about this movie, or if there's any like relevance to it today? I know there was talk about people wanting a remake in the last couple years. I don't know. It seems like something that could be popular among this Gen Alpha and Gen Z, but with you on the finger of the pulse of the youth of the cinematic future, what is your opinion on what this film's legs are?
Those students that I have, and I teach high school, so those students that I have who are involved in the drama club, who are involved in theater, they're familiar with it. To what extent, I don't know. I do know that my school has never done it, at least not in the 22 years that I've been there. As far as the film version, not too many of them, I have never heard any of them mention it. I've never heard a student mention it. And in fact, just last week in my film class, we were talking about cult movies. We were talking about this very topic. And the film that I used was The Princess Bride. And I said, okay, it's 1987 and, et cetera, et cetera. Huge cult classic. People quote it left and right. Everyone can recognize a line from the film, memorable characters, and very few of them had seen it.
Yeah, right.
A small handful had heard of it, but the majority had never even heard of it, which I thought was very surprising, but not surprising, discouraging, but basically gave me a personal mission of, okay, I am going to show you this movie and you're going to like
Right.
it. But so that's The Princess Bride. They didn't crack one smile, not one chuckle throughout the entire film. Not even, I mean, not any of the bits that, are considered some of the finest comedic moments. So as far as Little Shop goes, and I've never used it in my film class, but after having this conversation with you, I'm thinking I just might.
I mean, that's interesting.
To continue.
I think that's awesome because, and here's the other thing too, is like, let's take Sweeney Todd as an example, right?
Yes, which is on Broadway now.
Back on Broadway.
With Sutton Foster.
Was on Broadway for years. And unless you were a theater person, you really didn't know what Sweeney Todd was. But then Tim Burton makes a musical version of it in the late 2000s, and it becomes kind of like a millennial / like late Gen Xer goth anthem. People are now they're putting Sweeney Todd in the same kind of reverence as they would Beetlejuice or these dark, quirky kind of gothic movies like that, because Tim Burton did it. So maybe it just needs the right filmmaker that has like more of a grasp on what today's cinematic culture is if they were going to remake it. Because I don't think you could make it work if you just did a straight remake. Like, I think you would have to put a darker, more cynical twist on it, like Tim Burton does, so you can get these Gen Alpha kids and these Gen Zers that aren't going to crack a smile at Princess Bride interested in something that's really interesting and it's really fascinating. You just have to make it for the kids these days, right?
And I think the first step is to put back in the original ending.
Yeah, make it dark again. Make our movies dark again, for sure. I enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed this movie, and I love the fact that you played Mushnik in high school in this. It's like, yeah, I see it 100%. So, and I didn't know that when we decided on this movie. So it's great to know that you do have a personal history with it. Any last words you've got?
I will say, as far as last words, yeah, the film version of Little Shop of Horrors eliminates Mr. Mushnik's song that's in the stage.
Yeah, he has his own song.
He has his own song, and so I always felt a little, wait a minute, you cut my song. But they, yeah, for whatever reason, which is interesting because Vincent Gardenia was a professionally
He was a stage
trained
actor, yeah.
He was a stage actor. He was a song and dance man. So
absolutely,
so you have to wonder why they cut that out. But yeah, as far as last thoughts go, I say if they were to remake it, put back in Mushnik and Son.
Yeah, make it a little darker, make it a little bit quirkier, and I mean, hey, everything's merchandising these days. Make it merchandisable. Get it on backpacks. So many possibilities. Yeah, Audrey II is a great character that I think could be on every lunchbox and cell phone case and all that kind of good stuff. So
I can see Audrey II, Pez dispensers, the whole thing.
Yeah, love it. All right, so Silver Screeners, you are just always putting out great content, man. I love your show. This will come out a week from when we're recording it. So what can people expect on your show as they start checking you out?
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for those encouraging words. My next episode that I will be recording and editing this upcoming weekend, I am going to be taking a look at... each episode tends to pair up two movies that are linked somehow, whether they share a same director or maybe they're thematically linked. So the two that are going to be the focus of the next episode, Poor Things with Emma Stone. She just won the Oscar a couple of nights ago for it, directed by Yorgos Lanthimos. And the two of them also collaborated on The Favorite several years ago. So I'm putting together The Favorite and Poor Things, and I'm going to be discussing the hell out of both.
Yeah, great movies and very different from each other, like aesthetically and thematically. That's why I think that he's such a brilliant filmmaker, where you definitely can tell it's one of his films, but not all of his films are carbon copies of the last, which I really appreciate.
Yeah, it's like Wes Anderson, because he definitely has a style.
Yeah,
a style that all you have to do is take a look at 30 seconds worth of footage, and you can say, oh, this is a Wes Anderson film. And for a variety of different reasons, whether it's the perfectly symmetrical shots or whether it's the acting style that he encourages his cast to use to be a little bit
like wooden,
but yeah, just their demeanor is very jerky. The way that they would make they make sharp turns before they walk definitively down the hall. And
Almost as if
like
they
all
were
those-
animated characters themselves. Like when you watch his stop motion movies, you're like, oh, I get now why he has his actors do that. He's thinking as if it is an old Rankin Bass stop motion animated
Yes.
movie, you know? So yeah, awesome, man. I can't thank you enough. And people, go check out Silver Screeners, go back into the archives a little bit and find our conversation on his show where we did a double feature of Alice, Sweet Alice and the Bad Seed. One of my favorite cinema conversations I've had since I started podcasting. It's a great time. So thank you again for that. And need to get back on your show and do another double feature.
Thank you.
Everyone, you can find all my links on thecultworthy.com. You can find Frank and Silver Screeners in the Cultworthy Partners page of thecultworthy.com. And please like, subscribe, rate, review both of our shows. We love it when you do that. And subscribe to the YouTube. And Frank, it's a great time. I'll see you next week.
Same here. Thanks so much,